On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but she was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. She suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And so Janet ran downstairs and she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. There was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing. "What's wrong with you? And who was that guy?" And so Richard would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? And so she said to him, like, "Hey, do you want to go to the hospital? I can drive you." He said to Janet that guy from the NHS told me there's pain associated with this particular shot and it would just go away on its own. But 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital. Over those 48 hours, the injection site had turned red and began to blister and bleed, and then eventually it turned black. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. The doctors told Richard he would have to have emergency surgery to remove the rotting flesh. Richard began telling the doctors all about how 2 days earlier he'd gotten his COVID shot, and then it blistered and bled and turned black. Richard began describing the NHS guy. Now remember, Janet had only seen this guy for a brief second when she had run downstairs, but now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy, suddenly something clicked. This realization filled her with horror. It would turn out that NHS nurse was not really an NHS nurse. Instead, they were a man that both Janet and Richard knew very well. However, they were extremely well disguised. This man's name was Thomas Kwan. And Thomas, after coming inside their home, he injected Richard with a deadly pesticide called iodomethane. That pesticide immediately caused that excruciating pain and ultimately killed and began to rot away the flesh in his arm. Thomas Kwan was Janet's son, and he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. And so he decided he would basically inject poison into Richard, killing Richard to secure the house for himself. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison.